History remembers the rise and fall of legions, but it forgets the man who stood paralyzed as the laws of physics shattered before his eyes. Centurion Marcus watched the Galilean breach the heavens, and in that instant his loyalty to Rome died. He disappeared into the shadows of history, haunted by a memory so powerful it forced him to leave everything behind. Discover how one man's glimpse of the eternal ended his life as a warrior, and why the empire that trained him to kill without hesitation could never make him pick up his sword again. This is Torch and Testament, where we trade the pulpit for the record, and tonight the record has a soldier's name missing from it. Every Roman centurion carried the same unspoken creed, and it had nothing to do with gods. It had to do with steel. 20 years in the legions taught a man exactly one lesson worth trusting: what you can see, what you can weigh, what you can put an iron edge into. That is real. Everything else is a story told by frightened people. Marcus had earned his vine staff the hard way on the German frontier, where men who believed in omens died first, and men who believed in discipline lived to grow old. By the time his cohort rotated into Judea, he was past believing in anything he couldn't put his hand on. He had seen priests of a dozen conquered nations promise miracles to buy themselves one more day. He had watched every one of those miracles fail to stop a Roman blade. So when his prefect assigned a detachment to guard a tomb outside the city walls, a dead troublemaker, a carpenter's son the local council wanted kept dead and buried, Marcus took it as exactly what it looked like: a formality, a favour to nervous priests who were afraid of grave robbers and rumour, not resurrection. Here is the central question this episode has to answer, and it is not the question you expect. It isn't, did a man rise from the dead? Rome's histories are full of men claiming resurrections, and every centurion in the eastern provinces had heard a version of that story before. The real question is this: what does it take to make the most disciplined killing machine in the ancient world put down his weapon and walk into permanent exile? What does a soldier have to see with his own two eyes, trained by 20 years to disbelieve exactly this kind of thing, before the story stops being a rumour and becomes the only fact in his life he trusts? Because that is what happened to Marcus, not a conversion of the heart, a collapse of the evidence. To understand why that collapse mattered, you have to understand what a Roman gladius actually meant to the man holding it. It wasn't a weapon, it was a covenant. Every legionary swore the sacramentum, an oath binding him not to Rome the idea, but to Rome the God-Emperor, present and absolute. Break that oath through desertion, and the penalty wasn't prison, it was death, delivered by the very brothers you'd trained beside for a decade. Men didn't walk away from that oath over a change of feeling. They walked away from it only when the thing they'd sworn to no longer made sense of what they'd seen with their own eyes. That's the wall Marcus was standing at, 3 days after the crucifixion, when the whispers started reaching the barracks. The city of Jerusalem in that season was already a powder keg, and everyone in the garrison knew it. Passover crowds packed the streets, the temple guard was nervous, and underneath all of it, a rumour was spreading through the poorest quarters of the city that the Roman command found almost comically easy to dismiss. The tomb was empty, and the body was gone. Marcus's own men had been posted at that tomb. A Roman guard detail did not lose a corpse. That was the kind of failure that ended careers and, depending on the prefect's mood, ended lives. So the official story hardened fast. The disciples had bribed the guards, stolen the body in the night, and were now spreading a story to save face for their dead leader's failed movement. Marcus repeated that explanation to anyone who asked. He believed it, or told himself he did, because the alternative wasn't something his training had a category for. But something kept nagging at him. He'd questioned two of the men from that guard detail himself, hardened soldiers, not the type to fall asleep on duty and invent a cover story rather than admit it. Desertion of post carried its own death sentence, and every one of them knew it. They weren't lying to protect their careers. They were terrified, and they wouldn't tell him why. For weeks afterward, the garrison kept its ears open, the way soldiers in occupied territory always do, and the reports that filtered back were strange in a way that rumour and grief alone couldn't fully explain. People claiming to have shared meals with the executed man. Not a ghost story, meals. Bread broken, fish eaten, wounds shown and touched. A crowd of over 500 people, by some counts, all independently describing the same face, the same voice, in different places, at different times. A Roman officer knows the difference between mass hysteria and coordinated testimony. Hysteria doesn't hold up under cross-examination by a bored, skeptical centurion with nothing better to do than pick apart a story for contradictions. Marcus went looking for the contradictions. He wanted them. A clean, collapsible lie would have let him close the file and go back to caring about supply requisitions and border patrols. He never found one. What he found instead, over the following weeks, was something worse for a man who needed the world to make sense. Consistency. Consistency he couldn't explain away, sitting on top of a story he had personally helped guard against ever being told. He tried the standard interrogation tricks first, the ones that had broken 100 lesser stories in his career. Separate the witnesses, ask them for details out of order, press for the small, throwaway particulars that a rehearsed lie always forgets. What time of day, who spoke first, what the room smelled like. A coached story falls apart under that kind of pressure within minutes. This one didn't. Fishermen who couldn't read gave him the same account, unprompted, as a tax collector who kept meticulous records. A grieving mother described the same wounds her son's followers described, in the same order, weeks apart, without ever having spoken to one another in between. None of it, on its own, was proof of anything supernatural. Marcus knew that. Coincidence exists. Grief plays tricks on memory. But 20 years of cross-examining prisoners and informants had given him an instinct for the particular texture of a lie under pressure, and this story simply didn't have that texture. It had the texture of something people had actually lived through, however impossible that seemed, sitting in a Roman barracks with a lamp burning low. This is where the tension really lives, so let it sit for a moment. Imagine spending 2 decades building your entire understanding of the world on force, order, and provable outcomes, and then watching the evidence quietly, patiently refuse to cooperate with your explanation. That's not a crisis of faith, that's a crisis of competence. Marcus's whole professional identity was built on being the man in the room who couldn't be fooled. And here was a story that kept surviving every method he had for exposing a fraud. He started attending the informal gatherings, not as a believer, as an investigator. He told himself that every single time. But something nobody expected was waiting for him at the end of that investigation, because the followers of the executed man weren't hiding, and they weren't scattering the way a leaderless, defeated movement should. They were organizing, meeting daily, speaking about their teacher not in the past tense as a martyr to be mourned, but in something closer to the present tense, as a commander who had given them one final order and was expected to keep his word about something still to come. That word was ascension, and it was the last piece of evidence Marcus never planned on gathering himself. Roman religion had no shortage of stories about men becoming gods. Romulus himself was said to have been taken up into the heavens in a storm cloud, witnessed by senators on the field of Mars. Marcus knew that story the way every Roman schoolboy knew it, as useful political myth, not as something you'd stake your life on having actually seen. The difference this time was that he was about to become the witness himself, standing in real daylight with no storm cloud to hide behind and no myth to retreat into. He wasn't assigned to that hillside east of the city by accident. Rumours of a final gathering of the executed man's followers had reached the garrison, and a small, unremarkable Roman presence was sent to observe from a discreet distance, standard procedure for any assembly that size, in a province this volatile, during a season this tense. Marcus volunteered for the post himself. Whatever this was building toward, he intended to see the end of it with his own eyes, not hear it second-hand from men he no longer entirely trusted to describe things accurately. What he found on that hillside was ordinary at first. A modest crowd, a man addressing them with the calm authority of someone who expected to be believed without raising his voice. The same authority Marcus had heard rumours of for weeks, now standing directly in front of him for the first time. And then, without ceremony, without a storm cloud, without a single theatrical flourish that Marcus's trained eye could have flagged as staged, the ground simply let him go. Marcus would later struggle to describe the sensation to anyone. Not floating, not falling upward like smoke caught in a draught. Ascending, deliberately, calmly, the way a man might walk up a staircase he alone could see, until the clouds folded around him and there was nothing left in the sky but blue. The crowd around him gasped, wept, fell to their knees. Marcus didn't move at all. He stood exactly where he was, his hand still resting on the hilt of his gladius out of 2 decades of reflex, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that the weapon in his grip meant absolutely nothing. 20 years of training had prepared him for every kind of enemy Rome could name. Nothing had prepared him for an enemy that simply left, upward, without a fight, because it had never needed to fight him at all. This is the moment the entire episode has been circling since the first sentence, so let's sit inside it honestly, rather than rushing past it. What collapses in a man in a single instant like that? Not his courage. Marcus had proven that 100 times over on the frontier. What collapsed was his entire framework for deciding what was real. For 20 years, the gladius in his hand had been the final argument in every disagreement he'd ever had with the world. On that hillside, it became the single most useless object he owned. He unbuckled it that same evening, not in a dramatic public gesture, no crowd to witness it, no officer to report it to first. Alone, in his quarters, he set the blade down on a wooden table and simply looked at it for a long time, the way a man looks at a tool from a trade he no longer practices. Desertion from the legions was not survivable as a plan. Roman military law treated it as one of the gravest crimes a soldier could commit, punishable by execution, and enforced with a discipline that made examples of the men who tried it. Marcus understood every word of that law. He had, in earlier years, helped enforce it against other men. He walked away from his post anyway, in the quiet hours before the next watch change, wearing plain travelling clothes and carrying almost nothing. What followed was not the story of a man finding instant peace. It was the story of a fugitive. For a long while, Marcus moved the way hunted men move, through smaller towns, avoiding garrisons, never staying anywhere long enough to be recognized by a former brother-in-arms who might report him for the reward, or worse, feel honor-bound to finish the sentence himself. He traded his armor early, for coin and for concealment, and felt lighter for it in a way that had nothing to do with the weight of iron. He found the followers of the executed man again eventually, in small gathering after small gathering, scattered across the province and beyond it. And here the story takes its most human turn, because they did not welcome him easily. A former Roman officer, still carrying himself with a soldier's posture, still speaking with a soldier's blunt certainty, was not an obvious addition to a persecuted movement that had every reason to fear men who looked exactly like him. He had to prove himself through service, not through rank. Carrying water, tending the sick, standing watch at night, not as an officer commanding a post, but as an unranked man simply willing to stay awake so someone else could rest. It's worth pausing on the irony here, because it's the kind of detail that gets lost in devotional retellings. A man trained his entire career to command instantly, earned no deference at all in this new life. He had to relearn from nothing what it meant to matter to a group of people without an insignia to prove it. One account passed down through the community that eventually took him in describes the night that trust finally shifted. A Roman patrol passed unexpectedly close to the house where a small gathering was meeting, and panic spread through the room in an instant. The kind of panic people who have already lost everything once cannot afford to feel twice. Marcus was the only one in that room who didn't move. He knew exactly how far a patrol's torchlight carried, exactly how long they would linger, exactly which alley they'd check first if they suspected anything. He talked the group through it in a flat, unhurried voice, the same voice he'd once used to steady green recruits under fire, and the patrol passed without incident. Nobody in that room ever looked at him quite the same way again. Not as a former enemy tolerated out of necessity, as one of their own, whose old skills had finally found a use worth keeping. It didn't erase the danger he lived with. Every market he walked through, every road he took, carried the small, constant risk of a face from his old life recognizing him before he recognized them. He learned to sit with his back to a wall out of habit, not fear. Old training that never quite left him, even as everything it had once served fell away. The peace he eventually found was not comfortable. It was not safety, and it was not certainty about what came next, in a life with no rank, no pension, and a capital sentence still technically waiting for him if the wrong soldier ever recognized his face. But it was, by every account that survives in fragments through the early communities that sheltered men like him, a peace he described as more solid than anything Rome had ever offered. A peace built on having seen, with his own trained and skeptical eyes, something the empire's entire machinery of force could not touch, could not arrest, could not execute, and could not disprove. We don't know precisely how Marcus's story ends. The record of a deserter who spent the rest of his life in quiet, deliberate anonymity was never going to survive in Roman archives built to celebrate victories, not desertions. What survives instead are fragments, traditions passed through the communities that took men like him in, describing an old soldier, decades later, still occasionally recognized by the careful way he stood, the discipline in his posture, who would speak of the hillside only rarely, and only to people he trusted completely. When he did speak of it, those same fragments say, he never described what he saw as the most important part of the story. The most important part, he insisted, was what it cost him to admit it was true, and what it gave him in return for paying that cost. A gladius, once drawn, is the final word in almost every argument a Roman soldier will ever have. Marcus spent 20 years learning that lesson, and one afternoon on a hillside outside Jerusalem, unlearning it completely. He put the blade down not because he stopped being brave. He put it down because, for the only time in his career, he had finally seen something braver than steel, and he recognized, immediately and without argument, that it had already won. Because of the unpredictable behavior of the YouTube algorithm, this channel might never appear to you again. Subscribe to avoid that, like it if this video made any difference to your life, and share this content to your family and friends. Grace and peace.